Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. So today we are going to study about the transversalis fascia. Now the transversalis fascia is actually a component of an extensive thin layer of fascia that is present between the last muscular layer of the abdominal wall and the parietal peritoneum. Now the last muscle of the muscular layer of the abdominal wall is the transversus abdominis. So actually it is present on the inside, or it is lining the transversus abdominis muscle on the inside of the abdominal wall, and it is present between the transversus abdominis and the parietal peritoneum. Now it is continuous below with a similar fascial lining that is surrounding the pelvic wall. Now actually this fascia is named according to the structure which it overlies. For example, if it is present in the diaphragm region and if it covers the undersurface of the diaphragm, then it is going to be called the diaphragmatic fascia. Now if it covers the transversus abdominis muscle in the anterolateral abdominal part, then it is going to be called the transversalis fascia. And the same fascia, when it is present posteriorly, it covers the psoas muscle, and then it is going to be called the psoas fascia. And if on the pelvic down the lumbar region, if it covers the quadratus lumborum muscle, then it is going to be called the quadratus lumborum fascia or lumbar fascia. And if it covers the iliacus muscle posteriorly in the pelvic region, then it is going to be called the iliac fascia. Now we are going to visualize this from a picture of Snell. Now here you can see actually that's how the transversalis fascia is actually surrounding our whole abdomen and the pelvic cavity, abdominopelvic cavity. Now when it surrounds the undersurface of the diaphragm, so it is going to be called the diaphragmatic fascia. Then it covers the anterolateral abdominal wall part, and then that means it is behind the transversus abdominis muscle, then it is going to be called the fascia transversalis. And then the same fascia is continuing in the pelvic region, and then it is going to be called the pelvic fascia. Then it comes backward in the lumbar region, and then it is going to be covering the quadratus lumborum muscle, and it is going to be called the quadratus lumborum fascia. And then it is covering the psoas area, then so it is going to be called the psoas fascia. So that was about how the fascia transversalis covers our whole abdomen. Now as you can see, transversalis fascia is actually forming a sheath here that is called the femoral sheath. That means the femoral sheath is actually a continuation of the pelvic fascia and the transversalis fascia. And so the continuation of the pelvic fascia and the transversalis fascia is going to be forming the femoral sheath. Now if we zoom this part of the femoral sheath, you can see this part here that it is zoomed out. Now the abdominal blood and the lymph vessels are actually lying within the fascial lining, whereas the principal nerve, as you can see, this nerve, that is the principal nerve, femoral nerve, lies outside the fascia. Now the fact is important in understanding the femoral sheath. So this fact is really important, that the femoral artery and vein and the lymph vessels are actually lying within the fascial sheath, but the femoral nerve is actually lying outside of the femoral sheath, or you can say it is coming out of the femoral sheath. It is not the part of the femoral sheath here. Now the sheath is simply a downward prolongation. This femoral sheath is actually a downward prolongation, I have already told you, of what? Of the transversalis fascia and the iliacus fascia. And that is that fascial lining is actually surrounding the femoral artery, vein and the lymph vessels, and then the transversalis fascia and iliac fascia is going to be called the femoral sheath here in this part. This now this sheath, that is actually the femoral sheath, is about 1.5 inch, or you can say 4 centimeter into the thigh, and that it is present behind the inguinal ligament. Now this ligament, green ligament here, is called the inguinal ligament, and actually the inguinal ligament that is coming from the anterior superior iliac spine and attaching up to the pubic tubercle, and so it is actually present above the femoral sheath, and the femoral sheath is actually passing below the inguinal ligament downward into the about 1.5 inch or 4 centimeter into the thigh. Because the femoral nerve lie outside the fascial envelope, so that's why you can say it has no sheath. Also the area from where the femoral, you can say femoral lymph vessel or lymph node is passing, and that area is actually forming a ring that is called the femoral ring. And we have already studied that actually the inguinal ligament modification that you call the lacunar ligament. So the lacunar ligament is actually forming the medial margin of the femoral ring. We have studied this point when we studied the external oblique muscle, and when we studied the inguinal ligament, then we studied that the femoral ring median margin is actually formed by the modification of the inguinal ligament, that is called the lacunar ligament. Now the lymph vessel is passing through a canal, and that canal is, you can say, the femoral canal. Okay. Now in certain areas of the abdominal wall, actually the transversalis fascia is actually performing several important functions. As you can see that inferior to the level of arcuate line, when we studied the third level of the rectus sheath, that is, if you haven't taken the rectus sheath lecture, then I will suggest that first go and take the rectus sheath lecture and then take the transversalis fascia, because they are actually connected somehow. So when we studied that the rectus sheath posterior wall was absent below the level of arcuate line. That means that all the three aponeuroses of the muscles were forming the anterior wall of the rectus sheath, but actually the posterior wall of the rectus sheath was absent because there was not any aponeurosis of the three muscles present behind the rectus abdominis muscle. That's why you can say below the level of the arcuate line, actually the posterior wall of the rectus sheath was absent. Then what was actually present behind the rectus abdominis? If the rectus sheath posterior wall is absent below the level of you can see arcuate line, then actually the structure that is present behind the rectus abdominis muscle and that is surrounding behind the rectus abdominis muscle part is the transversalis fascia. That behind, but by behind I mean actually means on the inside of the abdomen. We are actually coming from the skin, then we are coming to the superficial fascia, then all the three muscle aponeurosis, that is actually behind the level of arcuate line. Okay, and the arcuate line level is actually around the level of the anterior superior iliac spine. At this level we have the arcuate line. Arcuate line, we have already discussed this part in the rectus sheath. Okay, now behind the aponeurosis of the three muscles that is forming the anterior wall of the rectus sheath, we have the rectus abdominis muscle, but the posterior wall was absent below the level of arcuate line. In that case the transversalis fascia is actually forming the inner lining of the rectus abdominis, and then behind the transversalis fascia we are going to have extraperitoneal tissue layer, extraperitoneal fat layer, and behind that extraperitoneal tissue layer we have the parietal peritoneum. Now you can also visualize the transversalis fascia, or we can study it from a picture of atlas that depicts the transversalis fascia. So here you can see the transversalis fascia when it is covering the undersurface of the diaphragm, it is called the diaphragmatic fascia. Now the arcuate line. Now this is actually this red part here that is behind you can say some vessels. That part is actually called the rectus abdominis, this reddish part. Now as you can see above the rectus abdominis there is some covering that is actually ending on the mid part of the rectus abdominis, and this covering was the posterior wall of the rectus sheath ending here, and at that point where the posterior wall of the rectus sheath was ending, that point was actually called the arcuate line. So that yellow area I have already highlighted in this point a little. So that point where the posterior wall of the rectus sheath is ending, that point is called forming the arcuate line, and there is a transversalis fascia. So actually the transversalis fascia is cut here for the ease of description, but the transversalis fascia is actually wholly surrounding our abdomen. So that means we actually have cut the transversalis fascia here, so you can see the rectus abdominis and the posterior wall ending and the ending of the posterior wall of the rectus sheath, but the transversalis fascia is then surrounding this part. So okay, there is also some point, and that is about the spermatic cord. I have been discussing the spermatic cord since we studied the external oblique, then we studied the internal oblique, and the external oblique muscle we studied that the spermatic cord was entering in the abdomen via the external oblique aponeurosis. There was a defect in the external oblique aponeurosis, and that was called the superficial inguinal ring. After that it is going to enter the pelvic cavity. So before entering the pelvic cavity, the last layer is actually the transversalis fascia. Now in the transversalis fascia there is also a defect, or you can say a hollow region, that is to provide a pathway for the spermatic cord, and that hole is actually called the you can say the deep inguinal ring. Now this is the deep inguinal ring. Here you can see a hollow space here that is providing a space for the spermatic cord. Now actually what is the spermatic cord? Spermatic cord is the cord that is carrying the spermatic vessels and lymph vessels and nerves through it, and that is actually forming the spermatic cord, and the coverings of the spermatic cord are actually derived from the we have already studied from the aponeurosis of the three muscles. So here from the margins of the deep inguinal ring, the transversalis fascia is actually going to continue surround the spermatic cord, going to continue it in the form of the internal spermatic fascia. So the same transversalis fascia, when it is going to surround the spermatic cord from the margins of the deep inguinal ring, it is going to continue as a covering of the spermatic cord, that is outside, covering the spermatic cord outside, but that is also you can say deep to the other coverings of the spermatic cord, because all the other muscles were actually present outer to the transversalis fascia. That means their covering will on the spermatic cord will actually be outer to the covering of the transversalis fascia, and that covering is called the internal spermatic fascia. So the part of the transversalis fascia that is covering the spermatic cord is actually called the internal spermatic fascia. We can also read this line from the Snell's, that from the margins of the ring, that is the deep inguinal ring, the fascia, that is the transversalis fascia, continues over the cord as a tubular sheath, and that sheath is going to call the internal spermatic fascia. So actually the internal spermatic fascia is the continuation of the transversalis fascia. Now that completes the transversalis fascia and everything about this fascia. Now we have been left with the last two layers of the anterolateral abdominal wall, and that are the extraperitoneal fascia and the parietal peritoneum. Now the extraperitoneal fascia is actually a thin layer of connective tissue that also contain some amount of fat. That's why it is also called the extraperitoneal fatty layer, and it actually lies between the transversalis fascia and parietal peritoneum. That means it is going to be on the inside of the transversalis fascia. We have the extraperitoneal fascia, and then after that we have the parietal peritoneum, and behind the parietal peritoneum we are going to have the visceral peritoneum, and on the inside of the visceral peritoneum we are going to have the peritoneal cavity, and in the peritoneal cavity we are going to have our viscera of the abdomen. Now the parietal peritoneum is actually thin serous membrane and is continuing below with the parietal peritoneum lining the pelvis. That means the parietal peritoneum of the abdomen and the pelvic cavity is the same. There is no distinction. The peritoneum that is surrounding the abdomen is actually continuing down into the pelvis, and it is also surrounding the pelvic cavity. Okay, so that was all about the layers of the anterolateral abdominal wall. We have completed all the 7 layers of the anterolateral abdominal wall. So until now we have covered all the 7 layers of the anterolateral abdominal wall. Now next we are going to continue the nerve supply of the anterolateral abdominal wall in the next lecture. So see you in the next lecture. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.